Welcome back. In this presentation we're going to learn the parts of the ear associated with balance and equilibrium. We're going to ignore the external ear and middle ear at this point because they're only involved in hearing, and we're going to focus just on those parts of the internal ear that are associated with equilibrium. The internal ear, the way it's built is it has a bony shell surrounding a membranous canal. There's a fluid in the bony shell called the perilymph, and inside the membranous canal there's another fluid called the endolymph. The bony labyrinth is subdivided into three parts: the vestibule and semicircular canals associated with equilibrium, and the cochlea associated with hearing. As you can see in this image, the cochlea here contains the cochlear duct. We'll come back to that when we're ready to talk about hearing. For now, let's focus on the other parts, the equilibrium parts of the inner ear. And you can see within the vestibule there is a utricle and saccule, and attached to those there are three semicircular canals, each one with a semicircular duct inside. If you look at a cross-section through the semicircular canal, you can get an idea of the relationship between the fluids and the walls. So the outer wall is the bony labyrinth, and it encloses the perilymph, and inside of the perilymph, floating in it, is the membranous labyrinth, and inside of that is the endolymph. So again, the vestibule is the bony labyrinth portion that contains the membranous portions called the utricle and the saccule. The utricle and the saccule each have little receptors for what we call static equilibrium. That's the effect of gravity and acceleration. The semicircular canals contain the semicircular ducts, and they likewise have little receptors, but these receptors respond to rotation of the head. So for the saccule and the utricle inside of the vestibule, we are able to sense gravity and acceleration, and from the semicircular canals we're able to sense rotation. So with equilibrium, what we're looking at, whichever kind of equilibrium it is, that you have sensory cells with cilia on them. And those cilia, those ciliated cells, are called hair cells, and the hairs are embedded somewhere so that when vibrations occur or when the head is moved and the little hairs are stretched, that starts a nerve impulse that your brain then interprets as equilibrium or hearing. Each semicircular duct has a little swelling on one end called the ampulla, and the ampulla has a little heap of cells inside called the cupula, and within the cupula there are specialized cells with stereocilia, which are just really long microvilli actually, and a single large cilium called a kinocilium, which is too much information for the test. So here you can see the ampulla of 1, 2, 3 semicircular canals, and each one of them, notice, is oriented in a slightly different direction. So one's in the sagittal plane, one's in the frontal plane, and one's in the transverse plane. And here in the ampulla you see this cupula. This is a gelatinous matrix. Here are your hair cells with their long stereocilia, so that when this fluid moves it bends the cupula, and when the cupula bends, that bends the hair cells, and when the hair cells bend, that starts a nerve impulse. The nerve impulse actually begins in the sensory neuron, which surrounds the specialized hair cell. For static equilibrium, the equilibrium associated with gravity and acceleration, we're moving to the utricle and the saccule, and what we find in them is that there are these little structures called maculae, which have these statoconia, which are crystals of basically calcium carbonate, kind of like chalk crystals, or small, even sort of like bone crystals, embedded in a gelatinous mass. And that whole thing is called an otolith. So here you can see the otolith with all the little crystals. And when these cells then, notice that the hairs of the hair cells are embedded in this gelatin. When you bend your head forward or when you move forward, that bends those hair cells, and when those hair cells bend, that starts a nerve impulse. Here are your little sensory neurons. Now, once the nerve impulse starts within the vestibule or the semicircular canals, then it's got to get to the brain, and it's going to go along the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which you learned in A&P1 is cranial nerve 8. Those are the nerves from the ear. So we have a vestibular branch that goes to the vestibular nuclei, which are located in the pons and medulla, and from there those impulses will relay to centers for equilibrium and balance, and you'll be able to activate the muscles necessary to maintain your balance. So the four functions of the vestibular nuclei: integrating information from both sides of the head, relaying that information to the cerebellum, which is your center for muscle coordination, and then to the cerebral cortex so that you have some sensory awareness of your sense of balance, and also to send subconscious reflex-like information to the motor nuclei in the brainstem and the spinal cord. So here you can see a view starting from the sensory receptors in the vestibule and the semicircular canals, giving rise to the vestibular ganglion in the ear itself. Following is the vestibular branch, which is going to join with the cochlear branch to form the vestibulocochlear nerve, which then attaches to pons and medulla, and then relays up, further up the chain, to the cerebrum, and also laterally to the cerebellum. So with equilibrium, the output of that is reflexive movements of the eye, the head, and the neck, and muscle tone to the head and neck movements, particularly through the vestibulospinal tract. That means from the vestibule down the spinal cord to go out to your skeletal muscles. Eye movements are associated with equilibrium, so we have a condition called nystagmus. Nystagmus occurs when your eyes kind of jerk, particularly if you're dizzy. So anytime that you get dizzy, like from spinning around and around and around in circles like kids like to do, you'll have this jerking motion of the eyes, this nystagmus, as the fluid in your brain continues to circulate until it finally has enough inertia to quit.